A handful of muddy salt lay on the shore at Dandi, free for anyone to touch. When Mohandas Gandhi lifted it on April 6, 1930, British law turned the gesture into a crime. The government claimed control not only over taxed salt in a market, but over crystals that nature had left beside the Arabian Sea. That claim supported colonial revenue and became the opening act of mass civil disobedience. Long before India, rulers in China, France, and the Ottoman Empire had discovered the same temptation. Salt was cheap, familiar, and demanded across social classes. Yet necessity alone does not explain why it could be taxed so effectively. The answer lies in a rare combination of biology, geography, transport, and enforcement. And in the moment that combination began to look less like finance than a claim over daily life. The object in Gandhi's hand was common food salt, sodium chloride, collected from seawater, brine, saline earth, or rock deposits. This is not a search for the first human ever to taste salt, and it is not a tour of every famous salt road. It follows a narrower question. Why did governments, separated by centuries and political traditions, repeatedly turn this ordinary food mineral into a monopoly, a compulsory purchase, or a tax hidden inside the sale price? The obvious answer is that everyone needed it. That is true, but incomplete. Everyone also needed water. Most farming societies depended on grain. Governments taxed land and crops, but neither water nor grain offered the same combination of steady demand and concentrated control. Water could be drawn from countless wells and streams. Grain was grown across millions of fields, changed with each harvest, and could provoke immediate crisis if officials took too much. Salt behaved differently. Before a state could profit from it, however, people first had to turn an abundant substance into a scarce, movable product. The human body needs sodium and chloride for fluid balance, nerve signals, and muscle function. But that biological fact needs a careful limit. People can obtain sodium from foods as well as from added salt, and historical diets did not require every person to buy an identical ration of white crystals. A salt monopoly did not literally own the body's entire sodium supply. What it captured was something more practical: a broad and recurring demand for salt as food, seasoning, animal feed, and, especially before mechanical refrigeration, preservation. Salt could help carry food through time. In sufficient concentrations, it draws available water away from microbes and makes many of them less able to grow. Combined with drying, fermentation, smoking, or cool storage, it helped preserve fish, meat, vegetables, butter, and cheese. It was never a magic shield. Concentration, cleanliness, temperature, and technique mattered. Yet a barrel of cured fish or meat could travel and wait in a way that the fresh catch or carcass could not. Salt therefore supported households, armies, ships, postalists, fishing communities, and towns whose food supply crossed seasons and distance. That made demand wider than the salt visible at the table. A family might need modest amounts in a meal, while a fishing port or dairy district required much more for processing. Livestock also consumed salt. Patterns differed sharply by climate, occupation, and diet, but substitution was difficult. Herbs could change flavor. They could not perform the same preservative work. A government did not need every buyer to purchase the same amount. It needed enough people and trades to return to the market predictably. This explains why salt could bear a charge, but not yet why the charge was collectible. A tax on an indispensable but freely available thing is only a law on paper. If every household could make clean salt cheaply behind its own door, the state would have to inspect every door. That would cost more than the tax produced. The fiscal opportunity appeared because salt is abundant in nature but unevenly convenient to harvest. An ocean contains an immense quantity of dissolved salt. But a coastline does not automatically create a productive salt works. Solar evaporation works best where evaporation exceeds rainfall, where shallow ponds can be built, and where land, labor, and seasonal timing cooperate. In wetter places, seawater may need fuel and vessels for boiling, making production expensive. Inland communities depend on exposed deposits, salt lakes, brine springs, wells, or mines. These sources occur in particular places, not evenly across a map. That is the first real answer. Salt was not a perfect tax because officials could count every grain. It was useful because they could place a gate between relatively few sources and very many mouths. Its durability made storage possible. Its regular demand made revenue predictable, and its production geography made surveillance imaginable. If you enjoy histories that reveal the machinery hidden inside ordinary food, subscribe. The next clue is where that machinery became a state system. Producing food salt therefore tends to leave visible infrastructure: ponds, wells, furnaces, mines, storage yards, workers, and roads. Moving it creates another trail. Salt is durable, divisible, and difficult to spoil, but it is bulky. Large consuming regions need carts, boats, pack animals, warehouses, or railways to bring repeated loads from source to market. Those practical facts gave rulers a choice. They could try to tax every consumer, or they could stand at the narrow part of the flow, control the mine, license the salt pan, require a shipment to pass through an official depot, or restrict which merchants can carry it, and the tax can be collected before the salt reaches thousands of villages. The buyer may never meet a tax collector. The levy arrives embedded in the legal price. The state has converted a few production sites and transport gates into a net spread over an entire population. The mechanism did not require demand to be perfectly fixed. Buyers could use less when prices rose, switch preservation methods, or seek illicit salt. What mattered was that ordinary demand did not vanish as easily as demand for a luxury. A modest charge, spread widely, could remain productive. That same structure made the burden politically unequal. When rich and poor bought the same basic quantity, the charge consumed a larger share of a poor household's resources. Fiscal reliability and social fairness pulled in opposite directions from the start. The gate still had a weakness. A legal price far above the cost of illicit salt created its own rival industry. Coastlines were long, saline earth could be scraped, and borders could be crossed at night. The same margin that enriched a treasury paid smugglers to evade it. Every salt regime therefore faced a calculation. How high could the state raise the price before enforcement consumed the gain, legal consumption fell, or ordinary people stopped seeing smuggling as a crime? Archaeology shows the production problem long before it shows a tax system. At Chongba, in the Three Gorges region of the Upper Yangtze, chemical residues, work areas, and changing ceramic vessels indicate specialized salt production emerging in the 2nd millennium BCE and becoming intensive during the 1st millennium BCE. The site does not prove the first salt making in China, and it does not by itself prove a government monopoly. It demonstrates something more basic. Salt could concentrate labor, equipment, and exchange in one productive location. Chinese states would repeatedly experiment with capturing that concentration, but there was no single unbroken monopoly lasting 2,000 years. Systems were created, contested, dismantled, and rebuilt. The clearest early imperial turning point came under Emperor Wu of the Western Han. His government faced the costs of military expansion and frontier policy. In 119 BCE, it established state monopolies over salt and iron, taking control of highly profitable industries that had enriched private producers. This was not merely a clever technical decision. It raised a political question that survives in records of the salt and iron debate held at court in 81 BCE. Defenders treated commercial intervention as a way to fund the state and its security commitments. Critics attacked the monopolies as burdensome and morally damaging to government. The debate did not abolish the salt system. Its importance is that people recognized the central conflict almost immediately. The same necessity that made revenue dependable made abuse difficult to excuse. The Han arrangement was not permanent, but the fiscal idea survived because later crises recreated its logic. The most revealing redesign came after the An-Lushan rebellion began in 755 CE. The rebellion devastated the Tang dynasty's finances and weakened the central government's grip on provinces and older tax mechanisms. The court needed revenue it could secure, even when it could no longer rely on the previous relationship between land, registered households, and the center. When Liu Yan became salt commissioner in 763, the solution was not to dispatch an imperial shopkeeper to every market. The state supervised production and controlled the crucial wholesale terms, while licensed merchants carried salt into consuming districts. Merchants paid the monopoly price near the start of the chain, then recovered that cost from buyers farther along it. Collection was concentrated. Distribution could remain commercial. That distinction changed the scale of what a salt monopoly could do. A government short of local reach could receive money before the commodity dispersed. It did not have to assess the wealth of every family or wait for a distant harvest. The official margin on a predictable flow of salt performed the work of an indirect tax. In later Tang government, salt became one of the central treasury's most important commercial revenues, although sweeping claims that it single-handedly sustained the dynasty go beyond what the evidence can bear. China also exposes why state monopoly can be misleading if it suggests total command. Officials depended on producers, licensed merchants, transport networks, and buyers who could turn to contraband. Later dynasties altered the balance between public supervision and merchant privilege. Salt certificates could become valuable rights. Authorized sales territories created borders where legal prices diverged, and illicit traffic became profitable. The state was not simply selling a mineral. It was manufacturing a legal route from source to consumer, then charging for access to that route. This is why the familiar phrase "white gold" obscures more than it reveals. Gold is valuable because it is scarce and can be hoarded. Salt generated recurring revenue because it was consumed, replaced, and purchased again. Its fiscal power did not rest on an extraordinary price per crystal. It rested on millions of ordinary transactions passing through a designed bottleneck. France shows what happened when that bottleneck became a maze. The royal salt tax, known as the gabelle, developed from the 14th century and helped meet the monarchy's fiscal demands. By the 17th and 18th centuries, however, it was not one uniform national rule. France contained sharply different salt regimes produced by historical privileges, bargains, and regional institutions. In provinces of the Grande Gabelle, salt was expensive, and households faced a compulsory annual purchase known as the sel de devoir. Other regions lived under smaller gabelle, systems linked to local salt works, or arrangements they had redeemed through earlier payments. Brittany was among the provinces where salt remained comparatively free and cheap. A short journey across an internal fiscal boundary could therefore transform the legal price of the same mineral. Compulsion made the revenue especially predictable. The Grande Gabelle did not merely wait for people to choose a legal purchase. The annual obligation turned households into entries on a salt ledger. Salt intended for one use could be restricted from another, and unused duty salt did not necessarily cancel the next year's obligation. The system treated consumption as an administrative quota. That narrowed uncertainty for the collector while making the injustice visible to the buyer. The crown and its tax farming system tried to hold this patchwork together through official salt granaries, rules governing purchase, and guards watching internal borders. From 1680, many indirect revenues were grouped under the Ferme Générale, a private tax farming organization operating for the monarchy. To the treasury, the gabelle converted daily consumption into cash. To a household forced to buy an official quantity at an official price, it made the state present inside the pantry. The price gaps created an obvious trade. Buy cheap salt in a privileged or lightly taxed province, carry it into a high-tax district, and sell below the official price while still making a profit. The people who did this were known as faux sauniers. Smuggling ranged from small household traffic to organized armed bands. The government answered with tens of thousands of revenue agents, searches, confiscations, and special judicial machinery. One regional study of the Commission of Rams shows the scale without pretending it represents all France. Between 1740 and 1761, the Commission tried 1,699 defendants and convicted 1,171. Available penalties ranged from reprimand and banishment to the galleys and, in aggravated cases, death. Yet the gabelle contributed roughly 4% of state revenue in the period examined. It was important, but it did not finance the monarchy by itself. Its enforcement footprint could feel much larger than its share of the treasury. Here, the central answer changes. Salt was attractive to governments not because it was a rare luxury, but because it was an ordinary necessity. A luxury can be postponed. Salt returned to kitchens, dairies, livestock, and preservation work. Yet France reveals the hidden condition. Necessity produces reliable revenue only when administration can keep people inside the legal channel. Raise the official margin too far or apply it too unevenly, and the tax begins financing the very smuggling network built to defeat it. The military engineer and fiscal critic Vauban identified that contradiction around the turn of the 18th century. He condemned the enormous regional inequalities, compulsory purchases, internal guards, and illicit trade they encouraged. His criticism was not that salt lacked fiscal potential, it was that a badly designed system converted productive subjects into offenders and spent resources policing boundaries that policy itself had made profitable. The gabelle became one of the most hated emblems of the old fiscal order. It was abolished by the National Assembly in March 1790. It would be false to claim that the salt tax caused the French Revolution. France's crisis involved public debt, privilege, representation, harvests, and a much broader structure of inequality. The gabelle matters because it made that inequality tangible. A family could cross a provincial line and discover that the crown valued its need for salt differently on the other side. In the 19th century Ottoman Empire, salt demonstrates a further transformation. A monopoly could provide more than current revenue. It could support a claim on future revenue and therefore on public credit. After the Anglo-Ottoman Commercial Convention of 1838, Ottoman officials developed a centralized salt monopoly while adapting to changing commercial conditions. Recent research shows this was not simply an institution imposed later by European creditors. It was an Ottoman fiscal experiment, an effort to replace dispersed collection with a centrally managed indirect contribution. By the final quarter of the 19th century, salt had become a leading indirect revenue. As elsewhere, unauthorized salt limited how far official prices and controls could be pushed. Then debt changed who stood behind the gate. The Ottoman government suspended payments on its foreign debt in 1875. Under the decree of Muharrem in December 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration received authority over assigned revenues. The income from the salt and tobacco monopolies, along with several other taxes and revenues, was ceded for servicing the restructured debt. The administration employed Ottoman subjects, but was overseen by representatives of creditors, most of them European. salt had become collateral in everything but name. A future stream of small purchasers could be projected, assigned, and used to reassure distant bondholders. It did not finance the empire alone, and foreign control did not create the salt monopoly from nothing. The revealing point is narrower. Because household demand was recurring and the supply chain could be administered, the revenue looked dependable enough to be promised in advance. That is a deeper form of state power than simply owning a salt works. The monopoly joined a mine or pan to a consumer to a treasury, and a treasury to international credit. An ordinary purchase at a market could end as a payment on sovereign debt. But in British India, the attempt to perfect this machinery would also expose its political weakness. British control over salt in India did not begin as one neat national system. East India Company policies and later colonial rules varied by presidency and region. Different duties encouraged movement between tax zones, and the inland customs line, including the famous hedge built along parts of it, was designed to obstruct untaxed salt. In 1878, the Raj equalized duties and removed major internal barriers, creating the basis of a unified monopoly. The Indian Salt Act of 1882 gave the government broad power to regulate manufacture, possession, transport, and sale. Uniformity did not mean the government physically produced every ounce. Much salt came from licensed Indian manufacturers, some from government works, and some from overseas imports. The Raj's decisive asset was legal control over production, import, movement, and duty. Railways and coastal shipping could then move taxed salt into regions with insufficient local supply. This was the mature bottleneck. The state could leave much of the labor and transport to others while reserving the authority that turned each legal shipment into revenue. For colonial finance, the appeal was explicit. Officials searching for dependable revenue preferred an indirect charge collected at production or import to an income tax that demanded knowledge of individual earnings and faced political resistance. The salt duty reached consumers regardless of income. That made it reliable and regressive at the same time. The payment did not rise with a buyer's ability to pay. In the last quarter of the 19th century, salt produced more than any other excise source and accounted for around 30% of indirect taxation. The collection cost was remarkably low relative to the net return. Yet this was not a static story. By the 1920s, salt supplied only about 6.5% of indirect taxation. That decline matters. It means Gandhi would not confront the Raj at its single most important financial artery. He would target something more politically useful than a maximum revenue stream. First, however, the government had to make natural salt legible as government property. Along the Bombay coast, boats, lighthouses, mounted officers, and inspectors watched salt pans and traffic. At Punjab salt mines in the mid-1880s, 32 inspectors and 1,265 men policed the operation. Workers at government factories could be searched, entering and leaving. Rules separated unauthorized production and trade from licensed spaces. The law reached beyond organized smuggling. A Bombay court ruling in 1876 treated having naturally formed salt on one's person as unlawful manufacture. Even after mere possession of salt water ceased to be an offense, 20th century prosecutions could involve coastal villages whose flooded homes were left with salt deposits. The quantities seized through such petty cases were tiny compared with legal output. That was precisely the point. Enforcement demonstrated that no quantity was too small to escape the state's claim. This machinery should not be turned into a false medical catastrophe. The salt duty was inequitable, and critics in Britain and India argued that it weighed most heavily on poor consumers. But recent scholarship finds that the monopoly did not produce famine in the way failures of access to rice or wheat did. Colonial consumption estimates are imperfect, Yet they do not support a simple story of nationwide salt starvation. Other forms of colonial extraction and deprivation imposed greater measurable harm. That correction makes the political outcome more interesting. For decades, officials could portray the tax as familiar, broadly accepted, and modest for each payer. Protests occurred, but salt did not consistently organize anti-colonial politics. The monopoly endured partly because its burden was dispersed into countless small purchases. What changed by 1930 was not the chemistry of salt. It was the discovery that a dispersed burden could become a shared political language. Gandhi had criticized the salt tax long before the march, emphasizing how an equal charge on an unequal population bore more heavily on the poor. On March 2, 1930, he wrote to Viceroy Lord Irwin with a list of demands and singled out salt as a necessity through which the state reached even the most vulnerable. 10 days later, he left Sabarmati Ashram with a small, disciplined group and began walking toward the Arabian Sea. To some of Gandhi's Congress colleagues, salt looked too small. They favored boycotts, a tax on land revenue, or more direct challenges to colonial institutions. Newspapers mocked the plan. Their skepticism followed conventional strategy: strike the opponent's greatest asset. Gandhi followed a different logic. He chose a rule whose injustice could be demonstrated without a manifesto, and whose breach did not require weapons, office, or wealth. The apparent smallness of salt was precisely what let a constitutional struggle enter ordinary life. The route to Dandi covered roughly 385 kilometers over 3.5 weeks. The duration mattered. A tax, normally encountered as a fraction of a market price, became a public argument moving from village to village. The marchers did not need to explain a complex constitutional formula. A government had prohibited people beside a salt coast from freely collecting the salt under their feet. This is the second great reversal. By 1930, the salt duty was no longer the fiscal pillar it had once been. Gandhi's genius was not locating the empire's largest cash box. It was choosing a law that made sovereignty visible and disobedience concrete. Land revenue centered the landholder. Labor disputes centered particular workers. Salt crossed class and region more easily, even though access, diet, and the practical ability to make it were never identical for everyone. At Dandi on April 6th, Gandhi lifted muddy, natural salt and deliberately violated the law. The gesture could be understood everywhere and imitated wherever people could collect saline earth, evaporate brine, sell contraband salt, or support those who did. Civil disobedience spread to other coastal districts and into wider boycotts and protests. Colonial enforcement now faced a problem larger than leakage from its revenue system. Every arrest advertised the claim the monopoly was built to hide. The state insisted that even self-made salt passed through its authority. The administrative strength of salt had become a symbolic weakness. For centuries, governments benefited because payment disappeared into the commodity's price. Gandhi separated the two. He made people see the law before they saw the salt. A pinch of illicit crystals became evidence that a government's control was not natural. It was constructed from acts, licenses, depots, inspectors, and punishments. And constructed systems could be refused. The march did not abolish the tax overnight or win independence by itself. Repression followed, and the monopoly survived. The 1931 settlement permitted limited local collection and sale in some villages, while the larger system remained. The salt tax was finally abolished in 1947, near the end of British rule. Nor should salt be credited alone with building Chinese states, sustaining the Ottoman Empire, causing the French Revolution, or ending the Raj. In every case, it was one component inside a much larger fiscal and political order. But the repeated choice of salt was no coincidence. Governments wanted a commodity with broad, recurring demand, few practical sources, visible production, durable stock, and routes that could be licensed or blocked. Those features allowed officials to collect from a narrow supply chain while spreading the cost across an enormous population. Salt's cheapness was not an obstacle. A small margin, paid repeatedly by nearly everyone using the legal market, could be more dependable than a large charge on a luxury people might stop buying. That system always contained its own limit. Increase the margin and contraband becomes more rewarding. Multiply boundaries and neighboring prices expose inequality. Criminalize natural production and enforcement enters fields, workshops, homes, and shorelines. The more completely the state claimed the commodity, the easier it became to see the monopoly as a claim over necessity itself. Return then to the wet shore at Dandi. The salt in Gandhi's hand was not valuable because the crystal was rare. It was valuable because a vast administration had placed itself between that crystal and the person bending to pick it up. For rulers, that distance had been the perfect place to collect a tax. On April 6, 1930, it became the perfect place to withdraw consent.